I had just handed my sick mother another $50,000 when a stranger said something that made my entire world stop. "Your mother certainly has enough savings," the woman said with a polite smile. At first, I thought I had misheard her. I stood there in the lobby of First Heritage Bank holding a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold, watching my 74-year-old mother slowly make her way toward the front doors. Eleanor Walker looked exactly like a woman who needed help. Her silver hair had thinned over the past year. Her shoulders seemed smaller than I remembered. Even her voice had grown softer. For nearly 3 years, I had been helping her financially. Medical bills, prescription costs, home repairs, utility payments. Every time she insisted she was struggling, I stepped in. Every time she said she would pay me back someday, I told her not to worry about it. She was my mother. That was enough. The latest check had been for $50,000. It came from money I had spent years saving. Money that was supposed to help pay for my daughter's college tuition. Money my wife and I had carefully set aside for emergencies. Yet when Mom called and explained that her medical expenses were becoming overwhelming, I never hesitated. Family came first. Or at least that was what I had always believed. The woman behind the customer service desk seemed to realize she had said something unusual. Her smile faded slightly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I probably shouldn't have said anything." I frowned. Enough savings for what? Her expression tightened immediately. "I really can't discuss customer information." Then she glanced toward my mother and looked away. The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds, but it stayed with me the entire drive home. My mother had enough savings. The words repeated over and over in my head like a song I couldn't turn off. That evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table while the November rain tapped softly against the windows. My wife, Lauren, noticed I was distracted. "Everything okay?" she asked. I nodded automatically. "Just tired." But I wasn't tired. I was confused. For years, I had watched my mother worry about money. I had listened to her describe overdue bills and rising costs. I had watched her carefully compare prices at grocery stores and cut coupons from newspapers. None of it had seemed fake. None of it had felt dishonest. Yet that sentence refused to leave me alone. "Your mother certainly has enough savings." Around midnight, I opened my banking app and reviewed the transfers I had made over the years. The numbers were staggering. 5,000 here, 10,000 there, 20,000 for a roof repair, 12,000 for medical specialists. The latest 50,000 sat at the top of the list like a monument to my trust. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. Maybe the bank employee had been mistaken. Maybe she had confused my mother with another customer. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. That was what I told myself. That was what I wanted to believe. But deep down, something had shifted. For the first time, a question had entered my mind that I never thought I would ask about my own mother. What if I didn't know the truth? The next morning, I called Eleanor just to hear her voice. She sounded cheerful, happier than she had in months. We spoke about the weather, Thanksgiving plans, and her doctor's appointment. Everything seemed normal. Then, right before we hung up, she said something that made my stomach tighten. "Thank you again for the money, Ethan," she said warmly. "You always take such good care of me." I stared silently at the wall after the call ended. Outside, the clouds drifted across a gray autumn sky. Inside, a feeling I could not name settled heavily into my chest. And for the first time in my life, I found myself wondering whether my mother had been hiding something from me all along. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking everything. Life continued as usual on the surface. I went to work. I attended meetings. I helped my daughter with her college applications. I even spent Saturday afternoon cleaning the garage with Lauren. But no matter what I was doing, the same question kept returning. If my mother truly needed help, why had that bank employee sounded so certain? I found myself thinking back over the years, replaying moments that had never seemed important before. After my father passed away 12 years earlier, my mother had changed in ways that were difficult to explain. She became quieter, more private. She stopped discussing finances with anyone, including me. At the time, I assumed grief had simply made her more reserved. Looking back, I wondered if there had been something else. Sunday afternoon, I drove to her house to help replace a faulty smoke detector. It was a small white ranch-style home on the edge of town. The same house where I had grown up. The same front porch where my father used to sit every evening with a glass of iced tea. Mom greeted me warmly and insisted on making coffee before we started. As she moved around the kitchen, I studied her carefully. She seemed comfortable, relaxed, not like someone buried under financial stress. Her refrigerator was full. The pantry shelves were stocked. A new coffee maker sat on the counter. None of these things proved anything, but together they created a picture that felt different from the one I had carried in my mind. While replacing the detector, I noticed several unopened envelopes stacked neatly on a side table. Most were ordinary advertisements, but one caught my attention. It carried the logo of a financial institution I did not recognize. Before I could read more, my mother picked it up and slipped it into a drawer. The movement was quick, almost automatic. "Just junk mail," she said with a smile. I smiled back, but something about the moment stayed with me. Later that evening, I called my younger sister Grace. She lived 3 states away, and we spoke only occasionally, but she knew our mother almost as well as I did. "Have you noticed anything strange lately?" I asked. There was a pause. "Strange how?" she replied. I hesitated. I was not ready to explain everything. "Not yet. I do not know. Different." Grace laughed softly. "Mom has always been different." Then her tone changed. "Why are you asking?" I almost told her about the bank employee. I almost told her about the growing knot of doubt in my chest. Instead, I changed the subject. After we hung up, I sat alone, in the dark living room. The television was on, but I was not watching it. My mind kept drifting back to that envelope, that drawer, that brief look on my mother's face before she hid it away. It was the first time I could remember her avoiding a simple question. The first time I felt as though there was a door standing between us. A door that had been closed for years without me noticing. And for reasons I could not fully explain, I suddenly felt certain that whatever answer I was looking for was hidden somewhere behind it. The following Wednesday, I found myself parked across the street from First Heritage Bank 20 minutes before it opened. If someone had told me a month earlier that I would be sitting in my truck watching my own mother's bank, I would have laughed. Yet there I was, gripping a cup of coffee and staring through the windshield as the morning sun slowly climbed above the rooftops. I felt ridiculous. I felt guilty. But most of all, I felt unsettled. The uncertainty had become impossible to ignore. Every small detail seemed to point towards something I could not yet see. At 9 o'clock sharp, customers began arriving. A few minutes later, I saw my mother's sedan pull into the parking lot. She stepped out carefully and adjusted her sweater before walking inside. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, just my mother going to the bank. Even so, I remained where I was. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Nearly half an hour later, she emerged carrying a slim folder tucked beneath her arm. The sight of it sent a strange chill through me. I could not explain why. It was only a folder. People carried folders every day. Yet I immediately thought about the envelope she had hidden at home. Another piece of a puzzle that seemed to be growing larger. The rest of the day dragged by. I tried focusing on work, but my attention kept wandering. Around lunchtime, I finally made a decision. I called the bank and asked to speak with someone regarding an old family matter involving my late father's estate. It was not entirely untrue. After several transfers, I reached a representative who politely informed me that privacy laws prevented her from discussing any active accounts. I expected that answer. What surprised me was what happened next. Before ending the call, she asked for my father's full name. After a brief pause, her voice changed slightly. "I see several historical records connected to that name," she said carefully. "You may wish to consult the attorney who handled the estate." My pulse quickened. "Which attorney?" I asked. There was another pause. Then she provided a name I had not heard in years. Harold Bennett. I thanked her and ended the call. Harold Bennett had managed my father's legal affairs for decades. After Dad died, most of the paperwork had been completed within months. At least that was what I had always believed. Why would his name still be connected to records 12 years later? That evening, I drove to the storage room above my garage where old family boxes were stacked against the wall. Dust covered many of them. Some had not been opened since we moved into the house. I spent nearly an hour searching through tax returns, insurance papers, and faded folders labeled in my father's handwriting. Finally, near the bottom of one box, I found a thick envelope. Inside were copies of estate documents from 12 years earlier. Most were exactly as I remembered. Then I noticed something strange. Several pages were missing. The numbering skipped forward without explanation. I checked again. The gaps were real. Someone had removed entire sections. I sat on the floor staring at the papers while the silence around me seemed to grow heavier. The bank employee. The hidden envelope. The folder. Harold Bennett. Missing documents. None of it made sense yet. But for the first time, I no longer believed these were separate coincidences. Somewhere behind all of them was a single answer, and I had a feeling I was getting closer to finding it. The next morning, I called Harold Bennett's office before I could talk myself out of it. I expected to leave a message. Instead, his assistant answered immediately and transferred me through. Harold sounded older than I remembered, but his voice was steady. When I introduced myself, there was a brief silence on the line. "Ethan," he said softly, "it has been a long time." I told him I had questions about my father's estate. Another silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Careful. Measured. "Some matters are difficult to discuss over the phone," he finally replied. "Perhaps we should meet." We agreed on Friday afternoon. After the call ended, I sat motionless at my desk. The conversation had lasted less than 3 minutes, yet it left me with more questions than answers. If there was nothing unusual, why did he sound as though he had been expecting this call for years? Friday arrived slowly. The weather had turned colder. Bare tree branches stretched across a gray sky as I drove toward Harold's office downtown. The building looked exactly as it had when my father used to bring me there as a teenager. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of old books and coffee. Harold greeted me personally. His hair was completely white now. Deep lines marked his face, but his eyes were sharp. He led me into his office and closed the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he opened a file drawer and removed a thick folder. My pulse quickened immediately. The folder looked old, well-preserved, frequently handled. Harold placed it on the desk between us, but did not open it. "Before we begin," he said, "tell me what brought you here." I explained everything. The bank employee, the hidden envelope, the missing pages from the estate documents, the growing feeling that something important had been concealed from me. Harold listened without interruption. When I finished, he folded his hands together and looked out the window. "Your father loved you very much," he said quietly. The statement caught me off guard. I had expected legal explanations, financial details. "Not that. I know that," I replied. "Then you also know he worried about you." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Harold exhaled slowly. "Your father worried that grief would affect your judgment after he was gone." The words landed heavily. I remembered those years. The exhaustion, the confusion, trying to help Mom while raising a young family, trying to keep everything together. Harold finally opened the folder. Inside were copies of documents I had never seen before. Several pages carried my father's signature. Others carried my mother's. I immediately recognized the numbering along the bottom corners. They matched the missing pages from the estate records stored in my garage. My heart began to pound. Why were these removed? I asked. Harold looked directly at me. "Because your father requested that certain information remain confidential until the appropriate time." "And when is the appropriate time?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he gave an answer that made the room seem suddenly smaller. "Possibly now." My eyes dropped back to the documents. There were account references, trust language, financial schedules. Most of it meant very little to me at first glance. Yet one number stood out immediately, a balance figure far larger than anything I expected to see. I stared at it for several seconds before looking back up. Harold's expression remained calm. "There is more to this story than you realize, Ethan," he said. And for the first time since this began, I started to suspect that my mother might not be the person hiding the biggest secret. For the rest of that afternoon, I sat across from Harold Bennett while questions crowded my mind faster than I could ask them. The number I had seen on those documents refused to leave me alone. It was far larger than anything my father had ever mentioned while he was alive. I kept looking from the papers to Harold, waiting for him to explain everything. Instead, he remained patient, almost cautious. "Your father was a careful man," he said. "He planned far ahead, sometimes farther ahead than the people around him realized." I looked down at the signatures again. My father's handwriting was unmistakable. So was my mother's. Whatever this arrangement was, they had created it together. That realization unsettled me more than anything else. For years, I had believed my mother was simply struggling to make ends meet after losing her husband. I had built an entire understanding of our family's situation around that belief. Now that foundation was beginning to crack. Why was I never told about any of this? I asked. Harold folded his hands. "Because that was not your father's wish." The answer irritated me immediately. I was his son. "Yes," Harold replied calmly. And because you were his son, he made certain decisions he believed were necessary. I leaned back in my chair. Memories began surfacing from years I had not revisited in a long time. The months after Dad died had been difficult. I was overwhelmed. My daughter was young. My career felt uncertain. Every day seemed to bring another expense, another responsibility, another problem to solve. Looking back, I could admit something I had never fully acknowledged before. I had not always managed money well during that period. There had been impulsive purchases, investments that did not work out, financial risks I probably should not have taken. At the time, I told myself I was trying to rebuild stability. Now I wondered how those choices might have looked through my father's eyes. Harold opened another section of the file. Inside were letters. Some were addressed to financial institutions. Others appeared to be instructions connected to the estate. Then I noticed a sealed envelope clipped near the back. My father's name was written across the front. Beneath it was a date from 12 years earlier. "What is that?" I asked quietly. Harold glanced toward it. "A letter. For who?" His expression softened. "For you." My stomach tightened instantly. Then why have I never seen it? Because the conditions attached to it were never met. The room fell silent. I stared at the envelope. 12 years. It had been sitting somewhere all this time while I lived my life completely unaware of its existence. I thought about my mother, about every conversation we had shared since Dad passed away, every request for help, every expression of gratitude, every moment that now felt slightly different when viewed through this new lens. Yet something still did not fit. If there truly was a substantial amount of money connected to my father's estate, why had Mom continued accepting financial help from me? Why had she never explained any of this? As if reading my thoughts, Harold slowly closed the folder. "You are asking the right questions now," he said. "But before you judge your mother, there is something important you still do not know." And as I stared at the unopened letter resting on his desk, I realized that whatever answer I had been chasing was even bigger than I imagined. When I left Harold Bennett's office, the sun was already setting behind the buildings downtown. Long shadows stretched across the streets as I walked toward my truck, but I barely noticed them. My thoughts were fixed on one thing: my mother. For weeks, I had been quietly building a case against her in my mind. Every hidden envelope, every vague answer, every unexplained detail. Piece by piece, I had convinced myself that she was keeping something from me. Now I was no longer certain what to believe. The drive home felt longer than usual. Several times I considered calling her. Several times I picked up my phone and then set it back down. I was not ready. Harold's warning echoed in my head. "Before you judge your mother, there is something important you still do not know." Those words followed me all evening. Lauren noticed my distraction immediately. We sat together at the kitchen table after dinner while rain tapped softly against the windows. "You have looked worried for days," she said. "What is going on?" This time, I told her everything. The bank, the documents, the missing pages, Harold, the sealed letter. She listened quietly without interrupting. When I finally finished, she leaned back and thought for a moment. "Do you think your mother lied to you?" she asked. The question should have been simple. Instead, I struggled to answer. A week earlier, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now I was not so sure. "I think she hid something," I replied. "I just do not know why." Lauren nodded slowly. "Those are not always the same thing." Her words stayed with me long after we went to bed. The next morning, I found myself driving to my mother's house. I had not planned the visit. I simply turned onto her street without fully deciding to do it. Her car was in the driveway. The porch light was still on even though it was nearly noon. I knocked. A few seconds later, she opened the door. For a brief moment, surprise flashed across her face. Then she smiled. "Ethan." Her voice sounded warm, genuine, the same voice I had known my entire life. Suddenly, all the accusations I had rehearsed seemed impossible to say. Instead, I accepted her invitation inside. We sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee. The familiar room felt different now, not because anything had changed, because I had changed. Every object seemed to carry questions. Every silence seemed heavier. Finally, I decided to ask something simple. "Mom, were there things Dad kept private before he passed away?" She looked at me carefully, not shocked, not defensive, careful. Then she lowered her eyes toward her coffee cup. "Your father believed some things required patience," she said quietly. "That sounds like a yes." She smiled sadly. "It is not always that simple." I waited for more. None came. The silence stretched between us. Then she looked directly at me. There was no anger in her expression, no fear, only a strange sadness. "You have been searching for answers lately," she said. My heart skipped. "What makes you think that?" "Because you remind me of your father when you were trying to solve something." I stared at her. For a second, it felt as though she knew far more about my investigation than she should. Then she said something that stopped me cold. "When the time comes, Ethan, I hope you will remember that not every secret is meant to hurt someone." And as I looked into her eyes, I realized she was not trying to deny anything anymore. 3 days later, Harold Bennett called and asked if I could come back to his office. His tone was calm, but there was something different beneath it. A sense that we had finally reached the point where answers could no longer be delayed. I arrived early. The same folder rested on his desk when I entered. Beside it sat the sealed envelope that carried my father's name. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Harold slid the envelope toward me. "The conditions have been satisfied," he said quietly. "This belongs to you now." My hands felt strangely heavy as I picked it up. The paper was old but well preserved. I carefully opened it and unfolded the letter inside. The first line immediately caught my attention. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then you have started asking the questions I always hoped you would ask." I stared at the words. It felt as though my father was suddenly sitting across from me again. His voice seemed to echo through every sentence. The letter was not about money. Not at first. It was about responsibility, patience, family. He wrote about mistakes he had made when he was younger, risks he regretted taking, lessons he learned too late. Then the letter shifted. He began writing about me, about the years before his illness, about conversations we had shared that I barely remembered. One sentence made me stop reading altogether. "You have a generous heart, son, but generosity without discipline can become its own kind of danger." I lowered the page slowly. Harold remained silent. He had probably seen this reaction before. I continued reading. My father explained that shortly before his death, he had created a financial structure designed to protect part of the family's assets. Not from strangers, not from market conditions, from poor decisions. He wrote that grief often causes people to act emotionally. He feared that after losing him, I might make choices that could damage my future and the future of my children. At first, anger flared inside me. He had not trusted me. That was the only conclusion I could reach. Yet as I kept reading, that anger slowly weakened. Because every concern he described reflected choices I had actually made during those years. Investments that failed, purchases I could not truly afford, plans that seemed brilliant until they collapsed. Somehow, he had seen those patterns before I did. Near the end of the letter, my father's tone softened. The final paragraphs focused almost entirely on my mother. "Protect your mother when you can. Trust her even when you do not understand her. She agreed to carry a burden that may one day cause you to resent her. If that day comes, remember that she accepted it because I asked her to." I read those lines twice. Then a third time. My chest tightened. Every assumption I had been building over the past several weeks suddenly felt less certain. Harold finally spoke. "Your mother kept her promise for 12 years. I looked up. "What promise?" He nodded toward the folder. "To carry responsibility that was never meant to be easy." The room grew quiet again. Outside the window, late afternoon sunlight reflected from nearby buildings. Inside, I stared at my father's letter resting in my hands. For the first time, I was beginning to understand that the secret I had been chasing was never really about hidden money. It was about something far more complicated. The next day, I drove back to my mother's house carrying a weight that felt entirely different from the one I had carried before. For weeks, I had been searching for evidence that she had deceived me. Now I was beginning to wonder how much I had misunderstood. The afternoon sun was low when I pulled into her driveway. Her car sat in its usual place. The front porch looked exactly as it always had. Yet somehow everything felt different. She answered the door after the second knock. The moment she saw me, her expression softened. It was as though she already knew why I had come. We sat at the kitchen table again. The same table where I had eaten countless family dinners growing up. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I placed my father's letter on the table between us. Her eyes immediately found the familiar envelope. Then she closed them briefly. "Harold gave it to you," she said quietly. It was not a question. I nodded. She looked down at her hands. They seemed smaller than I remembered. Older. Tired. "Dad asked you to keep all of this secret, did he not?" I asked. She remained silent for a moment before answering. "Yes." There was no denial. No attempt to avoid the truth. Just a simple answer. For 12 years. I asked. For 12 years, she replied. I leaned back slowly. Why? This time she looked directly at me. There were tears in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. Because he believed he was protecting you. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say I did not need protecting. But the letter sitting between us made those words impossible. My father had explained his reasoning with painful honesty. He had seen weaknesses in me that I had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Mom stood and walked toward a cabinet near the kitchen window. From inside, she removed a thick binder and placed it on the table. You deserve to see this now, she said. Inside were records stretching back more than a decade. Account statements, annual reports, legal correspondence, every page carefully organized. I began turning through them slowly. The numbers grew larger with each passing year. Investments had matured. Interest had accumulated. Assets had increased. What shocked me most was not the size of the account. It was what I discovered next. There were no withdrawals for personal spending. None. Not a single vacation. Not a luxury purchase. Not a new car. Nothing. The money had remained untouched except for routine management. I looked up in disbelief. You never used any of it. She shook her head. It was never mine to use. The answer hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had imagined a hidden fortune that my mother secretly controlled. The reality was completely different. Then another realization arrived. The money I gave you, I said carefully. The help over the years. My mother opened a second folder. Inside were records of every dollar I had ever given her. Every check, every transfer, every payment, carefully documented, carefully preserved. I kept track of everything, she said. My chest tightened. Why? A faint smile appeared on her face. Sad but proud. Because one day I knew you would need to know the truth. As I stared at the folders spread across the table, I finally understood something that had escaped me since the beginning. The secret account had never been hidden to benefit my mother. It had been protected for someone else entirely. And for the first time, I was beginning to suspect who that someone might be. 2 weeks later, Harold Bennett arranged a final meeting. This time, my mother was there. So was my sister Grace, who had flown in after Harold explained that the family needed to discuss matters that had been postponed for far too long. We gathered in the same office where so many answers had slowly come into focus. The folder sat on the table once again, but now it felt different. It was no longer a mystery. It was a record of sacrifices I had failed to see. Harold opened the meeting by reviewing the documents one final time. He explained how my father had established the trust shortly before his death. He explained the conditions attached to it. Most importantly, he explained why my mother had agreed to remain silent all these years. None of it had been about secrecy for its own sake. It had been about patience, protection, timing. Grace listened quietly while Harold spoke. Several times, she glanced toward Mom and reached for her hand. I noticed how tired my mother looked. The past few weeks had forced her to carry memories she had spent years trying to protect. Yet there was also relief in her expression. The burden was finally ending. Harold eventually turned the final page and looked directly at me. There is one last matter, he said. He slid a document across the table. I lowered my eyes and began reading. At first, the words barely registered. Then I read them again. And again. The beneficiaries listed on the trust were not who I expected. My name appeared first. Beneath it was Grace. Then my daughter. Then Grace's children. I stared at the page in disbelief. My mother was not the primary beneficiary. She never had been. The account had never truly belonged to her. It had been created for the next generation of the family. For us. A silence settled over the room. I slowly looked toward my mother. She gave a small nod. Nothing more. She did not seem interested in recognition. She did not seem interested in being praised for what she had done. She simply looked relieved that the truth no longer needed to be hidden. Harold reviewed the current value of the trust. Years of growth and careful management had increased it far beyond its original amount. The figure was larger than I ever imagined. Yet strangely, the money no longer felt like the most important part of the story. What mattered was everything I now understood. The late nights my mother spent worrying. The criticism she quietly accepted. The assumptions she allowed people to make. Even the financial help I had given her over the years suddenly looked different. She had documented every dollar because she intended to return every dollar. Not because she was obligated to. Because she believed it was the right thing to do. After the meeting ended, The others stepped outside while I remained behind with Mom for a few minutes. Neither of us spoke at first. Finally, I broke the silence. "I thought you did not trust me." She smiled gently. "Your father trusted you enough to build a future for you." I felt emotion rise in my throat. "I should have trusted you more." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You were searching for answers," she said softly. "There is no shame in that." We walked out of Harold's office together. The afternoon sun filled the street with warm light. For the first time in weeks, the weight I had been carrying was gone. I had spent so much time searching for a hidden fortune that I almost missed the truth standing in front of me. The greatest thing my parents left behind was never the money. It was the quiet love that protected our family long after they thought they would no longer be here to do it.